Hello, everyone. Welcome to our presentation for the 2025 NASPA case study competition. My name is Daniela Hernandez, and I use she, her, ella pronouns.
My name is Stephanie Meisterski, and I use she, her pronouns.
And my name is Leslie Gomez, and I use she, her pronouns.
And our faculty advisor is Doctora Melissa Aveita, and we are first year master students in the Post-Secondary Educational Leadership and Student Affairs program at San Diego State University. So now that you've gotten to know us a little bit, we'll be moving on to the next slide. The next slide is just a brief outline. These are all the main talking points that we'll be going over in our presentation. And here are the demographics that we did utilize for our presentation. This is all the information that we analyzed and we'll be discussing further throughout the presentation. As my team and I analyzed the case study information that we were given, we noticed that there were a variety of issues. Although, as we continue to discover new ones, we realized that there was one overarching issue that we have always been faced with in the past, even in current times, and that is that institutions continue to have systemic barriers that are disproportionately impacting our students of color. So, this is our main central issue that we focused on for this case study. Some of the secondary issues that do feed onto this main central issue were the closure of two major cultural centers as a response to the new state law that came out. Another one was the conflicting schedules for student protest and orientation. With that, we brought up concerns of campus safety, but also thinking about how are we still letting our students use their voice and have that space for themselves to be able to protest. Another thing was ineffective communication from our leadership. So we did see that leadership made these major decisions without even incorporating the student voice into it. And finally, a huge issue was unclear guidelines of the freedom of expressions. So all of these factors did contribute to a overall very tense campus climate that does require immediate attention and will be further discussing throughout the presentation. Now with that, we will be moving on to the next slide, and I pass it on to Leslie.
Thank you, Daniela. Now we will be talking about the theories. Specifically, we have selected a theory of racialized organizations in which Victor Ray argues that organizations are racial structures. Race has played a role in the development of organizations as it is constitutive of organizational foundations, hierarchies, and processes. Having that in mind, we are connecting this theory to the structure of K-State College and exploring the student experiences through this lens. We will also be talking about community cultural wealth, in which Yoso identifies 6 different forms of capital that educational leaders can utilize when engaging with students. Specifically, this model encourages professionals to view student experiences and cultural knowledge as assets rather than deficits. And just as background, oftentimes cultural deficits stem from racism within this institution, specifically higher education. And so it's important that we acknowledge these challenges and find different methods to change that. Following on Ray's theory of racialized organizations, we did want to apply it specifically to K-State College, and so we will be exploring it at the macro, meso, and micro level, and this has been adapted directly from Ray's theory of racialized organizations. And so thinking of K-State College at the macro level, as a reminder, there was a new state law that was being implemented that requires state colleges and universities to eliminate any offices, programs, or practices that exclude individuals due to their identity. And so while that is happening at the macro and institutional level, it also has an effect in the meso or organizational level. In this case, state leaders at K-State College decided to close the Hispanic Student Center and Black Student Center prior to the implementation of this law, just as a precaution. And so that decision at the meso and organizational level also directly impacts students at the micro and individual level, specifically as stated by some of the students in this case study. They feel as though leadership isn't being receptive of their needs and voices, and they perceive the institution's lack of action as their unwillingness and taking a stand for inclusiveness, belonging, and community.
All right, thank you so much, Leslie. So now we're going to cover a little bit about how to understand historical context in higher education. So my colleagues and I discovered that taking the standpoint from looking at the historical background is really critical to understanding the larger picture of what's going on here. So we have provided an argument from Gumport that historically higher education in the US was largely exclusive to a certain population and to privileged groups, and that the system and the way it was set up was really catered to these privileged groups initially. And this would limit access for others based on race, gender, and socioeconomic status. And over time, the mission had changed and it had expanded. And with this expansion, higher education had allowed a broader access for diverse student populations. And when we're looking at it from the student affairs role, the historical context of how student affairs emerged in higher education is that it's a critical field, and essentially it's designed to support the holistic development of diverse student populations. We see in the second article quoted here from Kumail that these efforts were key in responding to the evolving needs of, as mentioned, the diverse student body. And lastly, the shift towards underrepresented students. We know from the data that was provided for the case study demographics that 76% of the entire student population is Hispanic and Latino students, which is a whopping over 50%, almost the entirety of the student population on this campus, which is really, really crucial in understanding why this look at underrepresented students needs to be addressed. And this is essential for the success of the institution and the society, and that's provided by Harper. So next we're going to move into the recommendations for case study college. We will specifically be looking at prior to July 1st, on July 1st, and after July 1st strategies and recommendations. For the first slide here, we're going to look at the plan of action prior to July 1st. This is essentially going to look at what is going to be a strategic plan for the student protests that are to take place on July 1st. And so before July 1st, we really propose that campus leadership does everything that they can to engage directly with the student leaders in order to foster a collaborative environment. We are proposing that the Dean of Students, Dr. Regina Wallace, hire a campus climate counselor, which is essentially going to serve as a climate aid counselor in looking at the whole of what's going on campus with these protests and with this professional staff position dedicated to promoting a transparent communication with the entire campus. We feel that this will proactively address student concerns and also aligns with what my colleague had mentioned prior about Yoso's community cultural wealth model. We also propose that the campus leadership make a conscious decision to meet with the student leaders of the campus, like Jose Ramon Garcia Gonzalez.
Thank you. Now we will be talking about the plan of action on July 1st. First and foremost, we encourage leadership to follow through with what was previously agreed on with students. This would include allowing the student protest as it is the students' rights and has been approved and designated in a specific area. Secondly, following large-scale event protocol. This includes the logistics, security, and response protocols for any emergencies that are usually in place for any large-scale event. Similarly, we also encourage leadership to be available to listen to student needs and to maintain flexibility throughout the day. As we know, especially in this field, situations change quickly. It is important to be available and to make it your priority, to be available for students and staff, including orientation throughout the day for any changes that may occur quickly. And lastly, we do want to encourage leadership to acknowledge the student protests during the orientation. In this case, Ross Barkley, the director of orientation. We think it's important, as seen throughout history of higher education and even within the most recent year, protests have been a method of student activism. And so We think it is important that we acknowledge this during orientation, and this might be a good opportunity to also include students who may be both part of the planned student protest and the orientation, such as student Susie Torres, and really providing that space and opportunities for them to share what their experiences really are as a student. Again, for many students, student activism is a large part of their student experience, and so it is important to really highlight that in this space.
Thank you, Leslie. And now we go to our last plan of action, which is everything that we encourage leadership to do after July 1st. So, as we mentioned before, through the decisions that leadership did make due to this new legislation, we did acknowledge that this may have not been the most student-centered decision that they had made. So, we want to promote that the institution and leadership start practicing and ensuring that every decision they make is student-centered. This time is crucial to really demonstrate to our students that we are here for them, especially throughout such a rough transition with the new presented legislation and then the new decisions that did take away big major cultural centers for them. So this is where we want to start implementing those centered practice. We want to student-centered practices. We want to also start constantly meeting with our students, start developing partnerships with them. I think that's very crucial that we develop partnerships with them. So in this case, we could be talking to Greg Davis and Susie Torres that are both part of the Somos Unidos club, but also working within orientation. So how can we develop an effective partnership between us and those type of students so we can ensure that all the student needs and also the institutional needs are being met, and finally avoid performative actions to ensure that we are prioritizing our students. With that, we move to updating the freedom of expression policy. So this kind of falls into Dr. Regina Wallace, who is the Dean of Students. So we want to make sure that she collaborates, as we were talking about partnerships, she collaborates with the students to update that policy for the students. I really emphasize that for, I'm sorry, with the students. I really want to emphasize that with, because we constantly see that leadership is making decisions for the students, but not with the students. So this is a perfect opportunity to alleviate those tensions and really have those students have a seat at the table so they can know that the institution is supporting them. Another recommendation is leaning on academic affairs for student support. So we would like to utilize our academic affairs, such as the Latin American literature major with Doctora Cristina Perez, to find ways to restore those resources that were lost after that state policy came into play. So we could find ways that may still look into like the Latin American culture that pertains more specifically to the major, and this is open for all students and not specifically for one identity, so still stays within the parameters of the legislation. Now, and finally, so as we keep on discussing about our commitment to our students, we would like to apply for the Hispanic Serving Institution designation. As Nikki mentioned earlier, we do have a high Hispanic student population, so this is another opportunity to demonstrate to our students that we are still committed to them, and we could start implementing things like Servingness by Dr. Gina Garcia, which will specifically look into that specific population and all underrepresented students to ensure that we are properly serving them. Now, with that, we will be transitioning into the NASPA competencies that we thought really pertain to this case study.
Thank you, Daniela. So with the first NASPA competency we will be covering is going to be social justice and inclusion. And as we can see here, we have that sectioned off into three different parts. First, we're going to look a little bit into the demonstration of the competency and why it's important to be inclusive and why does social justice matter, being that these are initiatives that will be in response to the July 1st protest and it being on orientation. Focusing on this competency is important because this is going to set up the institution for many years to come. based off of the right plan of action. It really first starts with the staff, administrators, faculty, and even the students to understand what personal biases mean and what they look like. Once individuals are able to recognize this, see what the privileges are, perspectives, they're going to be able to reflect on different identities and why that's important to share these experiences and interactions and allow for these spaces to be able to be on campus. And we definitely feel, as we mentioned, that with campus leadership making a push to collaborate with students, especially like the students of Somos Unidos, that we really want to make sure with this social justice and inclusion competency that peaceful protests and students having their voices heard, needs being met, are really going to be something that's going to be implemented for the long run.
Now, another major NASPA competency that really pertained to our presentation was the law, policy, and governance competency. As we could see that new legislation did come into play, and this legislation, we have to be very strategic with it, really understand it, and more specifically, it requires the colleges to eliminate programs that exclude other students based on identities, which resulted in the closure of the two cultural centers, the Hispanic and Black student cultural centers, and this has raised a lot of significant challenges for our students. So to be able to address this, it's crucial to also include our students into our governance structures, as we didn't really do that before. So ensuring that we are being very transparent with them, ensuring that we are collaborating with them to make these big decisions. Another thing is ensuring that all of our policies that we are implementing are ethical and inclusive. So exploring those alternatives to be able to sustain the support and services that these centers used to provide. And lastly, as this issue gains attention externally, it's a vital opportunity to empower our students to engage civically, particularly in electoral processes, therefore fostering their role and being able to shape equitable policies not only within the institution, but also without. Now, our final NASPA competency is leadership, as we keep on mentioning leadership. And it's important to acknowledge that we also have to be able to put theory into practice. So, one theoretical leadership theory that I thought really pertained to this presentation was situational leadership. So, situational leadership is a very flexible and adaptable leadership style. This is where leaders are able to adjust their approach based on the needs of their team. So, within this situation, we're adjusting based on the needs of the people of orientation, based on the needs of our students of Somos Unidos. And while we're doing this, we're not only guiding them, but it's important to acknowledge that we're empowering these individuals to achieve their success while also building their confidence and skills. Another thing was self-awareness and teamwork. So here we have to start reflecting, like, how are we navigating the current student needs? How are we continuously reflecting on how we could alleviate these barriers that have been once again put into place through legislation? So we have to understand the campus climate. This could be done through the campus aid or even through surveys sent out to the institution, and looking for the best ways to collaborate with our students, different stakeholders, to be able to alleviate those tensions. And finally, change management and innovation. So constantly looking for ways to improve. How are we innovating our leadership styles to best serve our current students, especially with the new law that's in place? So being very innovative with finding new ways to serve our students.
Thank you. And now we will move on to the importance and external influence of becoming a student-centered institution. And so, just as a reminder, student affairs, the role is to really place students at the center of our work. And this is something that we are trying to encourage leadership in this case study to really focus and center on. And so, as we wrap up, I think it's important that we understand the impact of higher education in a global context. Higher education is structured to prepare students to become leaders across the world in a multitude of careers, spaces, and opportunities. And so, being that Case Study College is located in a suburb of a large and quickly growing city, it is important that students are prepared and equipped with the adequate knowledge to succeed in their work, both while in college and their careers after. So, as leaders, it is important that we are not only providing support to students in these situations, but also encouraging them to find solutions as students and in their experiences. Thank you. This was our case study presentation, and here are our references.